Welcome to today's webinar, Using Electronic Health Records and Time-Saving Technologies to Modernize Clinical Trials. I want to remind all attendees this webinar is being recorded. Any questions or comments can be entered into the questions and chat sections accordingly on the sidebar. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to Sina Adibi.
Thank you, Malcolm. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We've had a large number of registrants from all over the map, literally, so we're very thankful for you to make time so late in your evening from Europe. This is a second in a series of webinars that we have done with Optum. If you attended the previous one, you know that we have a very good collaborative relationship with the folks at Optum's Digital Research Network, and you'll hear more about that. Today we're having a panel discussion, and we are going to have, even though Malcolm said that you're in listen-only mode, we are going to have polls, so you will be able to, the audience, be able to participate with us, and also you can put questions in the chat box on the right-hand side. There is a palette. If you don't see it, there's a little orange arrow. If you click on that, it'll pop open and you can enter your questions there. And if we have time, we'll be able to respond to those. With me today is Cynthia Sinertia. She's the Vice President of Data Management and Analytics of the Digital Research Network, or DRN, in Optum Life Sciences. DRN is a division of Optum, and appropriately their tagline is redefining the clinical trial process. And by the time we're done with this session, I'm convinced that you'll see that they are really rising to that occasion. We also have, Cynthia as Vice President of Data Management and Analytics for the Optum DRN. She leads operational processes related to innovative digital trial design using eSource, something that is top of mind for many of us, managing databases and specifically EDC systems for clinical research. We also have Peter Payne. Peter is Vice President, Head of Digital Research Network in Optum Life Sciences. Peter has been the Head of Digital Research in Optum Life Sciences since March 2020. Peter joined Optum in January of 2019 as Head of Customer Solutions and DRN, following a career spanning over 30 years in biopharma and contract research organizations. And I am Sina Adibi. I'm President and CEO of Adaptive Clinical Systems. I'm a technologist by training. I was CTO of Thomson Reuters Healthcare, which is now Clarivate and Truvent. So I grew up with managing large volumes of healthcare related data, and from there to PowerExcel and Adaptive Clinical. We're the makers of a simple, secure, and compliant interoperability platform, which hopefully you'll see as a key ingredient for this project here. Now, that was about us. First of all, welcome, Peter and Cynthia.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having us.
Okay. And as I mentioned, we would like to know who you are. So we have a poll question coming up. Malcolm, if you could serve up the next slide, the poll question. So we would like to know what type of an organization you are with. And if Malcolm, if you could give folks a minute or two. How are we doing, Malcolm?
I see a lot of responses. I'll give everyone 10 more seconds to enter their answer, and then we'll close the poll.
Okay.
I think we have everyone's responses.
Okay. Very nice. So we've got 60% are tech providers and 30% are sponsors. Okay. And we've got 12% on CROs. This is great. I think what you will learn today, especially some of the really cool things that Optum DRN have done with patient recruitment, will be very relevant for the sponsors. And the CRO folks will be very, very interested as well in some of the really effective time-saving outcomes of this technology implementation. And of course, the tech providers, you'll see the significance of everything that we do to make clinical trials more effective. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll let Peter and Cynthia talk a little bit about this this research that was done. This was a bona fide study that really had clinical goals in mind, but at the same time, what I was very impressed with what you have done is how you really decided from the get-go that you were gonna innovate. And I think very often in this industry, when we embark on putting together a study, and as rightfully it should be, our primary focus is always the clinical accomplishment and getting the results that we want. And then technology solutions come in second. So if you could give us an overview of the study, some of the high level, what findings you had, and later on, folks, we're going to kind of by topic decompose their experience. So with that, Peter and Cynthia. Peter, you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So, and I'll give you a little bit of context. So when we started off, we were looking at, number one, being able to use electronic health record data and potentially claims data as a data platform for the conduct of clinical studies. And we looked at some of the pain points around clinical studies, namely patient recruitment and the collection and management of clinical data. And we started to develop some technologies, one of which is a patient finding application that we call Prospector, which basically allows us to put eligibility criteria into the tool, develop an algorithm which can then search across electronic health record data to find patients who match those eligibility criteria. And the other piece of technology we decided to develop was around being able to extract electronic health record data for a patient enrolled in the clinical study and get that into an electronic data capture system without there being any need for the sites to have to do repeat manual data entry. And so when we were sketching out our product plans for these technologies and our whole sort of plan for where we wanted to take this, we thought, no, wouldn't it be a good idea to go talk to the FDA about this? And so we did in October of 2019. And it was really a meeting around how about processes, procedures, quality controls, data quality, and we were asking them for their views on this, and they basically said at the end, well, we think you should go do a study and then come back and tell us how that went and what the findings were, not so much from a clinical perspective, but more from a process and data perspective. So we decided to sponsor this study. It was a non-interventional observational study, and it was really set up so that we could prove out that these technologies we've developed actually work and that we could make an impact on the time that sites spend on doing things like checking for eligibility for patients to enroll in the study, and also in the whole collection and management of clinical data. So that's the context behind it. I think if we go to the next slide, we probably have a schematic of what that study looked like. Yeah, so we referred to this as our proof of concept study because that's what we were trying to do, was proof of concept. We deliberately kept it relatively simple. We wanted to be able to find data in the EHR that reflected patients' typical healthcare encounters. And so the study had no structured visits. There were no prescribed visits for the patients. We decided that once a patient was enrolled, we were just going to collect data predominantly on laboratory and medication changes during their typical healthcare encounters. And we'll show you a little bit later some of just what that looked like in terms of the number of encounters that these patients had. The study was set up. It was 3 different healthcare organizations we approached who agreed to take part using 3 different electronic medical record systems. We selected a patient population with type 2 diabetes on metformin monotherapy, but poorly controlled with an HbA1c level greater than 7. So, a baseline patients had their eligibility. We found patients using our Prospector tool, basically gave the lists of those patients to the sites for them to confirm eligibility. And then once those patients were consented, we did actually have an ePro, which collected quality of life data using an SF36 score. And then we commenced the process of downloading their EHR data, mapping that and curating it into a study database from which we could then put data into the EDC system. The period of observation was 12 weeks. As I mentioned previously, there were no requested visits in this entire study. It was just, we just took data, largely looking at changes in lab parameters and changes in medications during that 3-month period of observation. So in terms of the workflow for this study, I'll cover the first bit, which was really around patient recruitment. And so we took the eligibility criteria that we described in the protocol, put those into Prospector, using each site's identifiable data that we have permission to use through our agreements with those sites, and then sent lists of potentially eligible patients to those sites. And then they were able to confirm eligibility and get e-consent performed. Once the e-consent was done, we would get an identifier, which would basically tell us which patient had just consented and give us the medical record number so that we knew which patient's data to start pulling. And the initial pull was all demographic data, medication data, lab data, medical history, etc. I'll hand over to Cindy now to talk about the actual data flow and data extraction that we used.
Sure, thanks, Peter. So basically, the onset of us going into the EHRs was the informed consent and notification. And as Peter said, we started the extraction of the historical retrospective data from the EHRs at that point in time. We had done specific mappings of each of these EHRs so we would know exactly where the data was coming from. We had set up a specification in our study database. The data came over in its raw form, and we also brought over not only the data, but the metadata. So we were able to pull out of the EHR the date and time that data had been entered into the electronic health record. So we essentially had a copy of the source data in our staging database. Once we got that data into the staging database, we did some normalization so that the data was normalized to our data model that was required for our study database. And then that data was used to create files to send over to be loaded by Sina's team into the adaptive clinical EDC system. And the data was loaded along with not only the subject data, but the source data, the source metadata, as well as any new data that came in throughout the course of the study. The data was loaded into the EDC. Sina's team worked really hard to create these unique EDC forms that actually had fields for capturing the source records from the EHR, and the data was managed in the EDC system as read only. So the sites would essentially be able to log into the EDC system the day after they had entered into the EHR and take a look at their own data to see, yes, it's all there. We didn't have to do anything, and the data was correct based on what was in the EHR. The data also included the eligibility confirmation from the e-consent, the SF-12, as it was done by the patients. And then as the patients continued on throughout the trial, any new data that came in was moved over on a nightly basis, going through the whole process of the mapping and normalization and putting into the EDC system. I think we can go to the next slide. Just as an example of the type of data that we were getting for these patients, it was small and was only 46 patients, 48 patients, sorry. But we did gather the demographics that included all of the things that the sites would have normally had to type into an EDC system. The medical history was very interesting because we went to the concomitant diseases sections of the EHR and pulled up any disease that had been documented into the system that had not had an end date, and you can see there were an awful lot of medical histories that were recorded. Concomitant medications were also captured, and then we followed those patients, and you can see during the study participation, we had additional data coming in. So as medical history was changed, as some of these systems are recording new diagnoses, or some of the projects, some of the patients had diagnoses that completed, medication changes occurred a lot during the study, as we had hoped to find and as we hoped to expect, so that we would be able to capture that information. And then the laboratory results, we were only looking for this study at the HbA1cs. Out of the 48 patients, 33 of them actually had another secondary HbA1c measured throughout their 12-week time period. We had also a lot of clinical encounters that occurred during the study, and I think that might be on the next slide when we talk about that. Yeah. So this study started in June of 2020. So guess what else was happening around that time? With the COVID starting up, most of our patients did not want to come in. So we basically did everything electronically. We enrolled patients electronically. We consented them electronically through their web interface at home. We captured the SF-12s through the patients logging in and recording the SF-12. All of the data was coming in electronically directly from the EHR extractions. And as you can see, we did have some patients who did have some actual encounters. We did see a lot of telehealth visits that are happening. So I think that's what a lot of our patients were deciding to do. Rather than going in to see their physicians, they were being seen through telehealth visits. We did have one patient have 19 encounters during those 12 weeks, so I think he was a very active patient. And we did actually identify an inpatient hospitalization that came into us through the EHR system, and we were the first to know about that. So we actually called the site and told them that their patient had been hospitalized. So because we're getting the data on a nightly basis, and we had systems set up to pick up, issues or new data coming in, we happened to be the first person to see that hospitalization, and we did wind up having to report that as an adverse event.
Wow. Wow. Imagine that, you knowing an adverse event, we knowing an adverse event even before the site knows. That's right, amazing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I couldn't contain my excitement on that one. That's amazing.
Yeah, and the site was pretty shocked. They were like, "What? You did?"
Yeah, really. I can see. Wow. Well, that was really good. You covered a lot of ground there. So what we've done for this, for audience's sake, is we've kind of broken up the learnings and how into 4 broad categories, and we'll kind of go around round robin and talk to those different ones. Next slide, please. Yeah, the first one we're going to talk about is with diverse data sources. I would like to make this broader. You mentioned ePro, you mentioned eConsent. You know, we also believe that the optimal configuration for clinical study is a heterogeneous environment. You know, we think that, you know, folks like Optum, you have certain technology platforms and that is backed up with your amazing database. And then there are other vendors that have other tools, but very few people have everything that a particular sponsor or CRO might need. So can you just sort of talk a little bit about how did you go about piecing together the technology pieces? How did you decide what you needed and that sort of stuff? Cynthia, do you want to take that one or? Okay, Cynthia, you go.
I think Peter was going to take that, weren't you?
Okay, Peter, you want to take that?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think the first thing, because I mean, everybody, EDC's been pretty widely used for quite a while now, but it has resulted in especially sponsors, developing extensive libraries of eCRF pages. And I think, one of the things about this was that, we didn't want predefined eCRF pages. We wanted to predefine the data fields that we were interested in collecting. And assessing whether those data fields were actually available in the EHR. So we needed to find, you need to have a solution with a certain amount of flexibility, and your team were great to work with. I mean, you were very flexible because this was something, new, a little bit different from the normal way of doing things in terms of defining data that you want to find. And I think overall, our intent was to make this as as virtual a study as possible. Our model is still, it's in some respects a site-based model in that any patient who gets into a clinical study that we're running is being seen by their usual healthcare provider rather than being referred to another site just for participation in the study. And the sites appreciate that. I mean, they like that. And I think with using, e-consent, I think we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the pivots we had to make during setting up this study. So we'll cover that a little bit later. But, e-consent, e-pro, not obliging a patient to have to come to a healthcare facility unless it was a part of their routine care, I think was all, were all things that the sites really, really liked. And later on, we'll see some of the comments from the sites on this. But I think, we had diverse data sources. We needed a solution that was flexible. And, as with anything new, I think, probably the first week of going live, we had one or two hiccups, which we were able to very quickly correct. And I would say that after that, the whole extraction, normalization of data and getting that data fed into the EDC system went extremely well. Would you add anything to that, Cindy?
No, I totally agree. It was wonderful. I mean, it is unique in that we had, like e-consent, eligibility confirmation coming in from one source, the e-pro coming in from someplace else, the 3 different EHR systems feeding in. So being able to consolidate all of that data and load it into EDC, into your systems, every night basically was just so much easier for the sites to not have to worry about, I have to go in and enter the data into the the EDC system the next morning. So it was very, very much appreciated.
Great. Next slide, Malcolm. This is the data flow that I think you kind of touched on here, right?
Yeah, it did, exactly.
Okay.
Maybe we can talk about the pivot.
Yeah.
I don't think so. What do you think? Yeah, maybe the pivoting part, Peter. What do you think about, sort of starting this in the middle of a pandemic and having to rethink how we were planning to do something?
Yeah. Go to the next slide, Malcolm. Yeah, okay. A great deal of planning and just listening to you was very clear that a great deal of planning went into this thing. I mean, obviously the novelty of your approach, you recognizing that and recognizing that trailblazing requires some planning and so on. So talk a little bit about that. And also, I want to quote our favorite Mike Tyson, who said, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the nose. which in your case was the whole COVID pandemic thing. Talk a little bit about how formal or informal, how long did you plan, to what extent did you think through, and then talk about those pivots that you mentioned.
So, I mean, the planning of this really started, following that FDA meeting at the end of October in 2019, and so we went live beginning of June, and we had originally planned to go live at the beginning of May 2020, but took a decision because of the pandemic to delay by a month. And we actually, the original intention we had was to supply each of the sites a tablet, which they would basically have the patient use that tablet to give their consent and complete their initial SF12. And it's a study, no therapeutic benefit for participation of the patient, although that said, we did see some improvement in management of their clinical condition, even though there were no interventions. But thinking, we don't really want to have to force a patient to come to a healthcare facility just for the purposes of being consented for participation in an observational study. So the pivot we made at that time was actually to develop a script that could be used over the telephone, so that physicians could consent patients remotely, and then also to pivot from a tablet-based, site-based consent process to one where the patient basically use their own device and go online, be guided through the consent process by the investigator, and then also got access to their ePro. And so that kind of put us back another month. We got IRB approval on that text, and then we went live beginning of June 2020. And in retrospect, that was a great, we may not have thought of that if it hadn't been for COVID. But I think going forwards, we would probably do that for every study we possibly could.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
unless the patient.
One of the things we did.
Unless the patient was required to come into a facility, and if it was an interventional study, obviously you'd need them to come into a facility to get their study drug. But there are also solutions around that, which you may be able to avoid that patient visit to the clinic. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And as you said, Athena, a lot of the planning was really getting under the covers of the EHRs, the 3 different EHRs, to make sure that we were getting the right data. Because sometimes when you go into the back end, you're not exactly sure what's going to be showing in the user interface for the EHR. So we had to make sure that as we went into the databases behind those EHR systems, we were pulling the correct data. And we did a lot of work back and forth with the sites to just verify that, this is where we're getting our ICD-10s from. Is this where you would get them? And those kinds of things. So we did have some learnings along the way, and that, sometimes the diagnosis codes wind up in the outbound claims and not so much in the concurrent diseases, and people don't generally stop their concurrent diseases. So we had multiple, diseases recorded that really weren't diseases, like, HbA or hemoglobin, not hemoglobin, I'm sorry, BMI measurements that were coded as, obesity, which the patients, every time their weight changed, the obesity diagnosis code would change. So It was interesting to see how that goes. Yeah.
Yeah, you certainly learn a lot of interesting things about EMR systems.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Even down to
and how they're used.
There's one out there that still records patient weighted ounces. What do you mean? That's okay for me, but really, patient?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, definitely. Go to the next slide, Malcolm. You kind of touched on this. I want to ask you a little bit about sort of partnership, and within partnership, not just technology, but you mentioned, Peter, that there were 3 sites that you were looking for, and you mentioned that 3 of them you wanted 3 different EMRs. So that had the technology piece covered. Were you looking for any sort of a mindset and psyche of a site? Because some sites are very, very traditional, and you can't tear them. I'm not being disrespectful, but you can't tear them away from paper. For you to sort of approach 3 sites with such an innovative, everything is hands off, everything is digital. were you looking for a profile? Did they come to you? Did you go? Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, thanks. That's a really good question, because it kind of gets to the roots of what the Digital Research Network is. And so, these three sites were, existing members of the Digital Research Network. So, they are sites from whom, we are getting electronic health record data, and they have signed up with us to become members of our network for the purposes of conducting clinical research. So they have already bought into the idea that this is something that can help them, and this is a new way of looking at getting clinical studies done. And so I think when we actually approached them, they were really enthusiastic, because it was early days for us, and we went out to them. We said, hey, we're going to fund this study ourselves, because we want to demonstrate that all the work we've done to validate the technologies and the procedures will actually result in a study that can be successfully conducted. And I would say that they were very enthusiastic about getting involved, and saw it as initial great evidence that something like this could become reality, because at the time they signed up, they'd signed up on the basis of a theory of what could be possible. And so I'd say generally, yeah, they were really excited at taking part and making this reality. And somewhere later on, we've got some great feedback to share from what they thought about their participation.
Wonderful. And
they're all early adopters, I would say.
Yeah.
Looking for ways to make things easier, better, faster, less expensive, less timely. Those kinds of things that we're all open for.
Right. And just one observation that I'll make, and I think what you all did was you also did a fine job in the composition of your internal team. You had the appropriate subject matter experts, people that hopefully Tracy Ort is in the audience here. Kudos to Tracy for being the most amazing project coordinator, taskmaster here. So how difficult was that to assemble the team? Did you have the team? Did you look for profiles of people within Optum? Did you recruit? Talk a little bit about how did you assemble that team?
Yeah, so the team was in place. Probably Tracy was one of the newer additions to the team, and yeah, I agree. She was a fabulous project manager. She's a great team member. Did a fantastic job on this study. But if you look at the kind of the profile of the team, we had Tracy, who's got extensive clinical operations experience. Before coming to Optum, she spent 20+ years mainly in academic medical center environment, involved in clinical studies. Key parts of the team are also the data engineers that we have, because you need people who really understand electronic health record data and can figure out ways to extract that data and pull it into a clinical database and an EDC system. So the team was very much a mix of clinical operations, data analysts, and data engineers.
Now, and so you had coalesced this team as part of DRN, or were they on loan to you? Okay.
Oh no, these are the core team members.
Okay.
Our core team is pretty small. We have, being a part of Optum, we have, access to other bits of this huge organization. So, all of our product development gets carried out by a group in product, which, is a little bit separate from the DRN, but they're kind of allocated to us for the development of our tools and technologies.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and we had a very good experience with your security and privacy group from the real. No, I mean this honestly in a very positive way.
Really?
Yeah, because if you think about it, right, security and privacy is one of those things that you really don't want to think about until something goes wrong,
Sure.
and then you kind of are thinking, why didn't we? It was very refreshing for us. We learned a lot from your group. Of course, this was from the real mothership of UHG that was working with us. And I think having that horsepower, let's say, of being able to tap into that level of expertise with predefined policies and procedures. Clearly your group had thought about all of those things. So GDPR was not something new that they were trying to figure out, what's that acronym? They already had frameworks around it, and fortunately we fit well in that. So that's also pretty good. Now, I want to go ahead.
I'll just make one more point on that, Sina, which is, that although what ends up in the EDC, is de-identified data, the starting point for us is PHI. And so, there is a huge amount of sensitivity around PHI and the security needs to ensure that that PHI remains protected. So, yeah. So I'm glad you were kind of to experience that from the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's we know this. You said something that I do want either one of you to spend 2 minutes and talk about that. You said something very intriguing. You said the patient recruitment part, right? So the e-source data blowing in directly into EDC, it's something that, FDA has been talking about since 2017, 2016 with their guidance. European Union has had, rulings on that. And I don't want to say, Cynthia, you did a good job of saying how tough that is. Who would have thought that weight would be measured in ounces, and be non-standard, something as trivial as that. But finding patients, making sure that you assist the site. And I think that's what I heard you say. Can you take like 2 minutes and talk about that methodology and how did you do it?
Sure. So I think it was mentioned at the start, one of the technologies that we developed is this tool called Prospector, which is a patient finding tool. And so you can basically take the eligibility criteria from any given clinical trial protocol and create an algorithm in Prospector on the basis of those eligibility criteria, and then use that to search in our electronic health record data for patients who match those eligibility criteria. Now, typically when we are starting that process, we are using de-identified data. And it will just basically say, yeah, there are X patients who match those criteria, and we actually get to see where their healthcare providers are and can then establish if those healthcare providers are a part of our network. Once we're active enrolling for a site, so once a site has been initiated, we take that same algorithm that we developed in Prospector and we'll apply it to each site's identifiable EHR data. And that enables us to effectively pre-screen or digitally pre-screen patients for inclusion in the study and let those sites know who those patients are. And we give them a whole bunch of information, patient name, medical record number, contact information, which criteria that we've checked, which we haven't, and sometimes there are things we can't check for in the EHR data, things like patient wishes to become pregnant during the course of the study, that's not going to be in the data. So there will always be items that the site need to screen for. But effectively what we're doing is telling them, hey, we already checked, these criteria, but we need you, when you consider that patient for inclusion, we need you to check on the others. And so what we did find was that resulted in, very little time being spent by the sites on confirming eligibility.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very cool. Okay, so we go to the next slide, please. So with that backdrop, we're curious to hear from the audience in terms of what are your patient recruitment strategies today? How do you go about doing this? And Malcolm is going to run the poll for us. You can pick more than one.
I see results coming in, Sina. I'm going to give all attendees 10 more seconds in order to share their responses to the question. With that said, let me close the poll and share the results, Sina.
Go ahead. Okay. So some folks are using analytics feasibility tools. 30% are using traditional. I hope that a lot of that is coming from social media and not contact centers. Interesting, very interesting. Okay, thank you. Go on to the next slide, please. Now, we did cover this quite a bit, but I just want to make sure that we talk a little bit about, you talked about the challenges, right? But once those obstacles were removed, like for example, people didn't have to do the mental gymnastic of converting ounces to pounds or kilograms or what have you. Can you talk about some of the benefits that we gained and maybe move on to the next slide for that one?
Yeah, I think this is
Malcolm,
some
move to the
feedback
next
from
slide.
our site.
There.
Yeah. So at the end of our study, we actually polled our sites to see what they thought about how it went, what could be improved, how much time they saved, if they thought we could do something that would be different and even more valuable. And as you can see from these statistics, 67% thought the data extraction from the EHR definitely saved them time, more than 50% effort being saved. So there was half of them indicated that they saved more than 75%. So I guess dependent upon how each site is using their EDC system and using the EHR to EDC, there's an awful lot of work. 83% of our sites thought they had a high level of confidence that the data and accuracy and completeness of the EHR data that we collected were accurate as what they would have entered in. And basically, there was, at the end of the study, we did provide all of the data that we had taken out into the EDC system to each of the principal investigators and the site staff to just confirm that what we had pulled would have been what they would have entered into an EDC system. So they did confirm that. And everybody thought that it was, high level of certainty that the data that was collected and managed was actually accurate to what they would have entered. So I think we were very, very happy, very satisfied and confident that we picked the right fields and we pulled the right data. We probably pulled more than they would have entered in if somebody had been asked to enter in, 800 and something historical diseases. They probably would have only picked, the most important ones. But we didn't choose to do that. We picked them all. I mean, my goal in life is to not have to enter data more than once. So if it's it's an electronic system, we should be able to go out and get it and move it to wherever we want to. And I think that's what we were hoping to prove, and I think we did prove in this study. Any other comments from you, Peter?
As unsurprisingly, we had 0 data transcription errors. Although actually, that said, it was interesting. We did have one of the data queries which will stand out forever in my mind was that between 2 clinical encounters, one patient's height went from like 5'5" to 5'11". My first instinct was say, wow, is that patient on growth hormone?
Really?
But it did turn out that it was a transcription error into the EHR, that somebody had entered 5'11" in error instead of 5'5". And what's even more interesting, when you look at EHR data, as we all know, when we all go to our healthcare providers, they never take your height. I mean, a lot of these patients, our height is taken, 10 years ago, and the first thing that happens when you go into a clinic, say, how tall are you? The last reference I have.
Yeah, you never grow, you never shrink.
I think I might have shrunk a little bit since then. My spinal discs may have collapsed a little bit since then, but
right.
Things like that are what they are.
That middle bullet, the second bullet, triggered a thought that it's worth mentioning was, confidence in accuracy and completeness. Since this was a bona fide clinical trial, I think we should mention, and this was all fully validated, in that we really put it through the rigors of making sure that the data is compliant. You touched on the identified data part of it a little bit, Peter, but talk a little bit about, like, I know we did quite a bit of the validation on our side, but talk a little bit more about the front end piece of it. To what extent did you validate that stuff, and how much of an effort was it?
Yeah, so there was a lot of effort in validating everything that we were planning to use on this. And even from right from the start, producing product requirement documents, and then developing test procedures, and then I would say that subsequent to us doing this study, we had we had an audit done of all of our processes and procedures, which was an internal audit, but we also decided to outsource to an independent body to actually come and audit this study, because we wanted to kind of get a view from an organization who hadn't had any involvement in it prior to that audit, to come in and say, okay, were there any major findings? And there weren't. We had a couple of minor findings, a couple of which were actually down to typos in some of our procedural documentation. But otherwise, it went really well. So we were very happy about that. But yeah, to get this going is a lot of effort. You do spend a lot of effort on testing and validating, but it's worth it at the end of it. It's worth it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at that, 100% of respondents. I don't know. Do you have any stats on like how much time they saved? I know some really attractive stats you have in the white paper, but anything off the top of your head?
Yeah, I mean, some of the stats in the white paper talk, things like, I think the average to confirm eligibility for a patient was like 3 minutes per patient.
Wow.
I think, looking in retrospect, with, if we had planned this all over again and went to do it on a larger scale, we might have incorporated, maybe a comparator arm that wasn't using this technology, and was just doing things the traditional way, and then record metrics on that. But that wasn't the intent to generate comparative metrics. The intent was to demonstrate that this is a reality that can be applied to clinical studies.
Yeah, right. Very good. Next slide, please, Malcolm.
It's one of our favorites. So
Go
these
ahead.
are just these are just some comments from some of the participating sites, and it kind of validated one of the things that we are one of the purposes we have in getting involved in clinical trials, is to try and make clinical research a more integral part of normal clinical care. And I think that we were successful in that, because we were able to, using this technology, allowed the providers to be able to focus really on the care of the patients, rather than having to worry about entering all the data they just put into an EMR into an EDC system later on that day.
And since I cheated, I got to tell you that you have this very interesting stat in the paper where manual patient finding went from almost 1 hour to 3 minutes, like you mentioned. I mean, that's a delight to any site.
Yeah. And that 1 hour is is a metric that we found in published literature.
Sure.
And then what we recorded as 3 minutes is what happened. So yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to the next poll, Malcolm, and see if we have converted anyone here. Okay. Are you considering any of these new digital sources? Go ahead and put up the poll. Malcolm, is this a multi-select?
This is. If you have multiple answers to the question, feel free to select multiple options. I see the attendees' response coming in. I'll give everyone 10 more seconds to reply. With that said, Sina, I'm going to close the poll and I'm going to share the results.
There we go.
I think we've converted everybody.
We have converted everybody. Okay, good. Good, 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 good. You know, actually, Cynthia, we cheated. This poll was something that we did back in February when we did that first webinar, and this number was
Oh, really?
not that high. So this is great
Interesting.
that the industry is really moving and headed in that direction. Okay,
Yeah.
next slide, please. I'm sorry, did you want to
I was
add
just going
something?
to say, Sina, I think that we all understand that not every trial will be able to capture all of the data from the EHR directly. There will probably be a need for some sort of hybrid study model. So there'll be some forms that need to be recorded by the sites that are information that are not in the EHR. But I think that, you know, if it's in the EHR and we can get to it and we can confirm that it's accurate and up to date, then I think we should use that data going forward for sure.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with you that you know, not every study, and I mean, look, if we saw that 100%, right? You know, source data verification was eliminated, data transcription. Frankly, if we reduce that number to 50%, we are still way ahead of the game. So I think
Yeah, for sure.
I think for sure it should be something that's considered. I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to take like 3 minutes of the remaining time and talk a little bit about some of our learnings at Adaptive. Sure. Some of the things, what we heard about was the Adaptive Clinical Data Warehouse, the Adaptive Clinical Bus that did the data loading and the transformations and so on. And our learning, and this is something that we came away with, was basically there is data is an enabler. That's the conclusion that we came to. Only if it's managed and processed right. So a lot of folks kind of strive to visualize data and present it in nice, pretty ways. And we thought that what's really important is you need to be able to manage the data, and that management is some of the interoperability, and moreover, you know, a lot of it being automating workflows. You know, we touched on some of that, and I think that some of those two areas at the bottom are areas we felt were overlooked. And that's what we set out to build in the adaptive data view. So next slide, please. So the challenge is, you know, certainly we saw what you saw. You know, in the blue are the silos of EDC and CTMS and EMR, EHRs, and then there are now new functional groups that are producing data, the labs and the core labs, and as diseases get more complex and studies get more complex, this fragmentation gets aggravated. And next slide, please. And then the other thing that we observed was that you now have groups that were not ordinarily data users. Like Cynthia, you have a data management background. You know, years ago, really job of a data manager was to be the curator of the data, right, and checking data. And we just wrapped up a SCDM where we hosted a session there. And truly, that's SCDM is Society for Clinical Data Management. Truly, this transformation of data managers moving from data cleaner uppers and data inspectors to data scientists, where they actually look to see patterns using data, is something that's happening. And the same thing for CROs and project managers in the CROs, you know, the dashboards of looking at how is the study progressing. So those functionals in orange are service groups that we thought we needed to also service with this product. And of course, to get data from the blue, which is all of the different sources of data into DataView. Next slide, please.
Mm-hmm.
And really, finally, the challenge for us, and by the way, this product was something that I think we launched it in March of this year. So you wrapped up your study right about the same time,
February.
was it? Or
Yes,
February?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
So
February.
yeah, I mean, we were certainly inspired by a lot of the learnings as well, and so we started working on this thing. And ultimately, really, to circle back to a lot of what you did, aggregating data, harmonizing data, cleaning it up is really the prerequisite for all of these business challenges, which is if you want to have risk-based quality management, if you want to do analysis, deep analysis of the data, that prerequisite is having the data cleaned and aggregated and pulled together. Next slide, please. I think we're almost done. I do want to thank you very much for sharing this with us. There is a white paper link that is available and will be sent out to you. I urge everybody to read the white paper. It's only 6-7 pages, and it's chock full of very impressive elements. Optum Forum is October 26th. And Peter will be speaking at Scope, and we'll be presenting there as well. And finally, we didn't get a chance to ask your questions, so please do send your questions to the emails that you see here. We'll be happy to respond to them. And if you would like to see demos of the Prospector tool, I'm sure Peter and Cynthia can arrange that for you, as well as the adaptive tool. This was really refreshing. Thank you very much for being so far out of the box in this thing. Thank you. It was really
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Nice
Thanks
to see
to
you
everybody for listening in. It's been great.
Okay.
Yes, thank